Alrighty, welcome everyone to episode 4 of Deciphering Software Modernisation. I'm Sam, software craftsperson at Codurance. Mac?
I'm Mike, software craftsperson, Codurance.
And I'm Abdul, delivery manager at Codurance.
Excellent. Introductions out the way, and on we go. So, I really always wanted to kick this off. Obviously, last time we spoke about discovery and the discovery part that happens in software modernization projects. One thing I want to talk about is, just kick this off, but it's really random. But I feel like in discovery maybe as well, but also when you start to get into the solution space and you've done the discovery, you move on. It's just the creativity that you need. You need to be creative. You can't necessarily come with like boilerplate solutions. This is exactly what's going to work here, or even the mindset of this hasn't worked before. What do you guys think about that? About being creative? And I'm not on about painting pictures and stuff. I mean creative in the sense of software development.
Well, so I think it's, we're past the discovery phase, and I guess the stakeholders agreed to most of the things that were figured out there. So I guess the team was creative enough, so that's like phase finished, and it was successful in a way that we have a backlog and we can move to the next part, I guess. But I guess on a more general level, it's I guess software modernization project is about being innovative and ingenuitive as well, and that creativity aspect is very, very important. The one thing to keep in mind is during all of that experimentation, know when to actually see that it's not going maybe the place where it should be going. So having in mind is like sunken cost fallacy in mind that may happen actually. So know when experimentation. Too much experimentation is too much, and okay, let's not go that route more, and let's try something else, for example, right? So that's from my experience, right? So just to be aware of that all the time.
So not ending up with like a never-ending spike, basically.
For example, this is going back to like the discovery phase itself, where you need to be creative, you need to figure out a lot of things, analyze, but then again, it's like, okay, that is enough. Let's start doing something, and then once we start doing as well, it may have not been the best idea in the end, right? We don't know in the end. It seemed to be, but once you start implementing things and working on some of the modernization work, it may not, or sometimes turn out to be like the best bet in the end. And you have to, as a team lead, for example, and a team in its entirety, to be aware of that and say, okay, that's maybe we should regroup and rethink some things. So.
That makes sense. So you're saying that constantly reevaluate and look at the path that you're treading, and actually try and recognize, is this actually where you want to go? Is it working out? And try and do that as soon as you can, which is obviously relative to depending on what you're doing.
Yeah, and software projects, especially modernization, it's very rarely that whatever was discovered and agreed upon at the beginning is like the end solution. And it's quite rare, I would say, from my experience. So it's always at least some kind of variation of the solution, if not very different.
Also, I guess the problems you encounter are often quite different and special. They're not necessarily other problems you might encounter on different projects. I know right at the beginning of the series, we spoke about greenfield projects. Some of the issues that you encounter there are quite different, and so they would require different solutions. Whereas in software modernization, I do feel you have to sort of have that creative element. But you're right that you need to have that ability to recognize when you need to regroup and say, actually, maybe we need to reconsider this approach.
The thing that whatever happened during the discovery shouldn't be taken for granted for the entirety of the project. That's kind of the thing. So you always need to be aware.
As you were talking, Mac, it just made me think about, just the agility that people often think about. A new greenfield project is just as much needed in a software modernization project, and people might overlook that and not actually appreciate that you do need that level of agility to think, well, this might not be going in the direction we want to. We're going to have to pivot, etc., and try something else. And as you say, not sort of have that march to the end without actually, when you know that something's not right.
I was actually, as you were speaking, I was thinking a little bit about how much creativity is actually needed in a modernization project, because I think it's actually necessary all the way through the life cycle. Because in many ways, creativity comes from constraint. So, if we think about even art, there's a natural constraint. You might be painting in 2 dimensions, and you have to try and how do you create 3-dimensionality to your painting? I think there's a substantial aspect of that in software development, right? So, in an ideal world, there is no creativity. You apply the pattern as it is, and it's all perfect. But in reality, and I'd say especially in modernization projects, you have a lot of constraints. You have constraints in how software may be designed, in the role and responsibility of that software, the distribution of its domain. And these constraints mean that you often have to think outside the box, right? You've got to come up with this different way of solving the problem that no one else may have kind of come up with. Often I think that's where there's a lot of that kind of R&D aspect of modernization, where you kind of come across this issue. It's a very unique permutation. You're not going to find anything in Stack Overflow, and you really have to kind of whiteboard and think, okay, how are we going to get over this hurdle? So I would tend to agree. I think creativity is really important all the way through the life cycle in order to overcome what can be quite substantial technical hurdles.
Some people will face problems and be like, it's just not going to work. Like you say you'll run an experiment. It's like, it's not going to work. But actually, particularly in software modernization, if you've evaluated different solutions, say you're in experiment A and you identify that there's 3 potential ways you could go. Sometimes, if the other ones actually like you've already looked at them and you say actually they're not going to be a better solution, then sometimes you actually find a way in the first experiment to find a way to get through. And as you say, be creative. And you're, something where you initially confronted a problem and you came to a conclusion, wow, that's it. You can't just cut it off and say that's it. It's not gonna be possible. But for sure, there may be some constraints that you just can't beat, and you say actually it wouldn't be worth our time and money to try and tackle this. But yeah, there are some way, a bit more time and a bit more thought, and as you say, a bit more creativity, you can overcome them and actually get through. So yeah, no, it's a good point, Abdul.
Yeah, you have to be, this is like, we are working like a creative space, right? So software engineering, like platform engineering, this is like, very creative space, like intrinsically, right? But like software modernization project has this special license of this, like, maybe not like crazy scientist, but this like for experimentation, I guess, more than obviously than a typical maintenance project. Well, just meet your SLAs, right? Just, make sure the tickets are processed, progressed, and done basically. And in greenfields, it's usually tons of that at the beginning, but then it's raised for the deadlines mostly, right, as well. Instead of like promoting that creativity is just, okay, we had enough of that. Let's just get the deliverables out there so that, the stakeholders are happy and our deadlines are met. And again, it's in software modernization, that's kind of intrinsic nature of that kind of project. That's creativity from the beginning till the very end.
I want to move the conversation on slightly, just because we've touched on a few things, and I want to talk about. So you finished the discovery. You're just sort of beginning. I don't want to say implementation, but you're on to the next phase, whatever each team want to call that. But you're actually starting to work in the solution space, and as you say, you maybe run some experiments. Is there like a gap? Do you advocate like a gap between starting one phase and the other, or is it like, will it start the next day, the same day as you finish discovery? Like, how do you do that? And is there any sort of, I don't know, celebration as well of finishing the discovery, which could be 2 weeks, could be longer? What do you guys think?
So for me personally, I like to try and time box the discovery. I think it's really important. So, we talk about sprint zeros. I think they're important because more often than not, you'll never have enough information. And it's kind of natural to start with a bit of discomfort because The reality is that your first few iterations will also be kind of discoveries, right? Because as you start to work in that software, you start to work to refactor the kind of business logic, to start to understand the test cases. There's a lot of detailed discovery essentially going on as you practically work with it. And it's probably not until a good few iterations in, at least in my experience, that you really start to see the velocity come in from starting to understand the domain, at a truly detailed level. So I have a preference, time box it, and then you say, all right, on this day, all things going well, we'll get started. I think that's very important. I think it's also important, and I think Maciej will probably touch on it a bit more, to recognize, where we've got to. More often than not, at the end of a discovery, it can be a bit disparaging, right? Because you've learned a lot, but it's that kind of aspect of learning a little bit sometimes can show off how ignorant you are. So you kind of see that the kind of scope that you need to learn about. So I think it's important to also recognize you have learned a lot, and you will continue to learn as we implement. But we're out of that phase where we're just dedicating time to try and discover the domain. Now we're going to work on it and do that discovery or learn more as we implement.
Go on, Matt. You have your thunder. I know you're gonna have so much to talk about. I want to come back to a few things you said, Abdul, but you go first, mate.
Many times we are discussing, the team health and that kind of aspect. And as we discussed last time, the discovery phase is quite taxing on the team, on the health, and in that area. So it's just important, is okay, just close this chapter and celebrate in some way. And how you should do that, I guess, is not the the topic of this conversation. It's up to each team to decide what to do. Well, it's not as easy as it used to be, like right now in the most remote era, but still just something official, like a celebration that the team knows that the chapter has ended and there's something new happening. So it's a small thing. It may seem to be a small thing, but it's important. And the celebration should be a part then of an ongoing things that the team does, right? So whenever there is a success, let's do a small celebration, whatever that is, but let's mark it with that kind of celebration. So that's important, because you thought discovery was hard. Well, it's going to get probably even harder at this point, right? Because now there is some expectations, right? So stakeholders are expecting some certain things to be done, certain areas to be looked at. And what I can add, from the beginning, I guess software modernization is all about that change management in some ways. So we want to change things, I guess, not only the software, but also how people, the cultural aspect, maybe even of the organization, or if it's a smaller endeavor, like within a department, for example, I guess, or certain workload. So I think it's important. Because usually there's a lot of problems these stakeholders will have at the very moment, right? There's a lot of burning things that they're hindering the lead time to production. So if you start with, okay, we are modernization team, let's figure out a grand vision. We know more or less, we did the discovery, the analysis. Let's figure out the grand vision. Let's work on that grand vision. And that may not be the best idea, right? Probably you should start with actually digging into whatever is is biting the most the existing business agility, I guess. And in with time, working on that vision as well. But just something to keep in mind if we go, okay, let's think about the vision. And I made that mistake as well myself. You may find yourself that, you may lose, in the eyes of your stakeholders, because they still have those very burning problems. Keep talking about this vision instead of actually helping them in the very moment, right? So just something to keep in mind at the very beginning of your actual work.
Well, there's so many things to dig into in what you both said, so many nuggets. One thing, if you don't mind, Matt, just got to go back to something Abdul said, and then there's loads of things I've added, and feel free to do the same as well. You sort of said, Abdul, and it's a really good point, that it's not necessarily that you end the discovery and that's it. You said it, those sort of activities will continue into the next phase. And I think that's a really good point, because it would be possible that people would get the impression that that's it. In those 2 weeks, you've learned everything. That's it. There's no more discovery, right? And some people might think, oh, that's it, brilliant, right? Clear path. And as Matt, you were saying, that you don't just take it for granted and say, well, this is what we're exactly going to do. It's set in stone and it's never going to change. So I think it's really important to actually have that, have those expectations that discovery will continue. We'll always discover things. We'll always continue discovery, and there'll be experiments, etc. But it's more that in that next phase, there's more of a switch and a bias towards like action that actually results in visible things that you're going to see and changes and work towards that. Whereas the discovery might be more information gathering, trying to better understand the problem, so you can then put yourself in the best place you can, at least at the time, for the next phase. So it's a really good point, Abdul, that it's not quite as clear cut as discovery's finished. Oh, there'll be no more discovery work, etc. So that's really good. So I just want to pick up on that. There was loads of things to pick up on, but that was good. Some good nuggets. So I mean, you haven't got any examples, Mac, of celebration ideas for people?
As long as it's there, as long as some kind of celebration is there, right? So I don't know. It's maybe actually I know it may be weird, but doing some kind of a hackathon for a day or something, maybe bits not what you think of a celebration, but it may be some kind of a celebration, right? So actually, instead of just talking, like, let's actually do some things and start with like a hackathon or something, for example. And then maybe let's bring in some people from outside of our team, outside of the modernization team as well to that, to chip in as well. So that celebration might be actually some actual benefits for the future, actually. So
I think there's a lot of stuff to be mined as well. You sort of spoke about it, Mac, around the fact that the discovery itself, there is actually a lot of stuff being delivered. Even the information, the things you uncover in the discovery can be extremely useful to whoever the stakeholders are. And that's not to be underestimated as well. Like discovery, of course, is mainly, predominantly about understanding the solution, information gathering. However, there's lots of things and actually value that can be delivered in that time. And I've seen it happen before. Which on the flip side, and you mentioned this as well, is you can also create an expectation as well, because you even within that initial stage where people maybe wouldn't have the perception that you'd be delivering value so early and so often, then they're like, oh great, Abdul, you're doing a great job. Look what you've done in discovery. You really used some information we didn't actually know that about our product. And then it creates the expectation for those initial sprints and then from then on. But that's the challenge as well. How can you keep pushing and improving as a team to meet those expectations that you set quite early on as well in the discovery?
It's a really good point, actually, especially on kind of discovering essentially the scope of the problem. So, I think we've all been in that situation where we've been given a very kind of broad problem statement. We can't deliver software without defects, or it takes 6 months to release software. And very quickly, through the discovery and through the implementation especially, you start to uncover a lot of problems typically. And as you said, there can be an expectation that it's something that can be done immediately. I do tend to caution. I mean, obviously we don't necessarily want to talk about scope creep in the traditional sense, but certainly maintaining the priority, I think, becomes really important. So you will find more messes than you can solve. And I think it's important that you highlight those. Okay, these are things that, on a strategic basis, we can put on a backlog and say, okay, we need to maybe, look at our config management. We need to look at maybe our infrastructure as code. Maybe we need to look at maybe, the version of the software we're using. But to put it in context of what the priorities are, these are things that we can do, but might not be something we do immediately because we have other things to challenge. So other challenges to address. And I do think it's very important you do that. Otherwise, you can end up in a situation, I feel, where you end up kind of just, trying to fix everything all at the same time, without that particular focus. So we've got to do that, got to do that, got to do this. And you're not necessarily delivering the value that you would otherwise be doing if you had focused simply on what is providing the highest value to the business and to the client at that instance in time. And it's difficult because it can be big issues that you want to fix immediately, but I do think you have to have that constraint and that discipline to focus on. Okay, document it, present it, put it on the backlog, focus on the top priority.
Like, I don't know, like in initial stages, the person you're working with might say, we're having issues deploying bug-free changes. We also have long QA cycles, and also the application is quite slow, and it's actually noticed by the end users using it, like it's visible, like degradation in performance. And as you said, well, what are your tips for helping them know where to start? And this goes back a bit to what you said, Mac, around that you have this vision, but also there's some things that maybe are some pain points that are hurting right now.
So I think we touched on like two things here, like typical prioritize and execute, right? So whatever during the discovery happens, we also make it clear that we're going to focus on one thing only, and we'll try to deliver it, bring it to the end as soon as possible, and with as holistic solution as possible, I would say. But also, just to close down on the discovery itself, something that came to my mind is a lot of the times, again, it depends on the stakeholder and the steering group, whatever is summon that modernization effort. They may be, okay, you know that there's just some bad things happening, try to figure out, but you may have like very dedicated stakeholders and they think they know what is the problem. And just keep in mind that you may need to actually break their heart a bit, that there's something else is a problem, and you shouldn't be afraid of doing that. So that's something important to keep in mind, actually. And it's your like duty and job as a software modernization team to actually pinpoint that those original thoughts and ideas of the stakeholder, what is the cause of the problem is, well, it's not, it is, but it's only a part of the problem, and there's actually a bigger problem, and this is how it is, right? And what was your problem, what you thought, is not what we propose to work as the first step, for example. So it's something to keep in mind, not be afraid to tell that to the stakeholders, right? So not to follow whatever, from their initial advice, because they're the stakeholders. No, it's like you're there to question that, right? And don't be afraid of doing it.
I think another thing to add on that, to help you manage those stakeholders as well, is to remember to be relatively agile with all this. So, we're going to prioritize the most important things. We're going to agree that with our stakeholder, as difficult a conversation as that is, but also to focus on delivering in small increments throughout the project, because that's what's going to give you the flexibility to, be able to get to other priorities, right? So if you focus on potentially a very large scope of work that's going to go on for 6 months or a year, it doesn't really give you the opportunity to, change priorities based on what adds the most value to the business in that instance in time. So I think being focused on trying to deliver small increments and essentially nudge your key metrics or whatever it is you're trying to solve in the right direction, so then you can see whether other things become a higher priority, whether there's more return for other priority items that you need to modernize or refactor within your software or architecture. So I think that's always really important, right? Like we talk about discovery and implementation, but it's always about keeping it tight discovery and with tight increments within your implementation that allow you to reprioritize as you go through your project lifecycle.
Yeah, and isn't that the case, Abdul, like a lot, right? So the stakeholders, they have so many ideas, they try to pull on so many strings, and it's like your job actually, you're going to pull on this one. Because if you just follow whatever stakeholder is telling you, they're telling you so many things, they're all over the place, you'd be dissolved in your work, right? It wouldn't be able to actually deliver fast enough something tangible. Yeah.
Like the world doesn't sit still for 6 months, so you need to be aware that things can change, the landscape can change, and also as you get further into it, you may discover things to say, actually, we need to reassess, as Matt was saying at the beginning. It might not be a complete change in direction, but it might be that actually this is a problem that we've noticed. This needs to be solved. And as you said, it might not be the problem that some would want to hear solve, or it's one of those things where maybe people all know it's a problem, but no one wants to solve it because they're like, oh, this is going to be a real pain to solve this thing. But actually could be fundamentally like one of the things that would actually give them the most bang for their buck, so to speak.
Yeah, but have some conversation at the discovery phase. You should be able to have at least those like two sets of data, one for like SDLC, what are the impediments in the SDLC, what are problems in the SDLC. So the typical, the four, like the metrics of like, lead time to production, mean time to recover, delivery frequency and, change failure rate, plus the more architectural ones, right? So in terms of security, scalability, availability, resilience, and performance, and you have those conversations and you have like, what is the problem with architecture right now, where it should be in terms of those factors, where it's not. So that would be something to keep in mind, right? To like having that laser focus on whatever should be the first thing to do. So in terms of like tools that you could use, it's a very valuable thing. So SDLC, like inefficiencies and architectural, they are called quality attributes, right? That should be aware where they should be and where they are not at this moment.
And that's a really good point, right? Like that's that focus on the problem, and throughout the life cycle of your project, I do think you're right. The stakeholders typically try to bring you solutions. We need this implementing, we need that implementing. But I do think you're absolutely right. You need to focus on those key metrics, those outcomes. What are the outcomes you want? And then try to kind of deliver those outcomes as the professionals that are recruited to do so. Yeah, I agree with you, Mac. I think that's really important, actually.
It goes back to what you were saying earlier, Abdul, about the fact that there's no sort of clear division between discovery and what comes next. In one way, I mean, you could view the whole thing as one big experiment, right? You're constantly evaluating how are we doing against the data? Are we moving the needle in the right direction? Do we need more measures? Because maybe in the beginning you establish some measures, but actually they're sort of somewhat imperfect. And you're not going to get absolutely perfect measures, but you might decide actually we need to pay attention to this data as well, or develop a mechanism to get that data in the first place. As well, which is another part of software modernization. It's not all going to be super clear, and you can maybe have the data sitting on your lap and just be able to read through it. Sometimes even actually the effort of getting that data in the first place could be a step on the journey.
I would say that the whole thing is, as you say, would be a massive experiment, simply because you're going to fail a lot, right? So more often than not, you are going to end up making assumptions. You have to make assumptions. At some point, you have to make assumptions. And, that will either, they'll either be proven true, your solution will work, or it won't. And because of that, every iteration, every increment of work in many ways is its own kind of experiment, right? You write your stories, you're making at some level, even with your client, there will be some assumption about what the behavior should be, what the test cases should be, etc., so on and so forth. And it's all about, I guess, within that increment, finding out early on that the assumptions haven't been realized. You test it, you think, oh, okay, something's dropped off, or some behavior has changed subtly. So you're putting those kind of safety net. But inevitably, throughout the cycle, your assumptions are going to be proven either right or wrong, which constantly requires reevaluation of your plans.
Yeah, I think that's a key point here, and this is like where this like sprint zero, I think, should be focused around. So this, like, before we start, what is the safety net, and also what are the measurements we are trying to improve upon, I guess, so that from the very beginning they are there, and with time we should be moving them to the positive direction. And in terms of the safety net as well, that's another, like, on a more technical basis as well, in terms of having, like Sam, you touched upon it, like during last conversation, having those like golden master tests, so that kind of safety nets, that once you start modernizing things, also you have something in place that will tell you that's, well, you want to modernize, but also we don't want to break existing stuff, right? So maybe initially start to thinking how to not break those things. What are the metrics we are trying to improve upon? and then only start doing something complete. So
it's funny you should mention Golden Masters, because correct me if I'm wrong, Mac, but I think before you've actually used those before as a measure, as in you've progressively tried to hit a certain amount of, like, this is what the current implementation does, and you've actually progressively worked towards getting them to exactly the same behavior, right? So you've actually used those as a way in themselves to measure, which not a lot of people would actually think to do and use them that way.
yeah, you seem this is like a safety net purely, right? But actually, if your modernization is refactoring on the site type, not refactoring in place, then that is a great indicator of actually your progress, your modernization progress, right? Because if you're refactoring on the side, which is this so-called strangler pattern, basically, so you start fresh, so there is nothing implemented on the side. You still need to run all that Golden Master test suite as you do for the legacy part, which is passing, it's green. Your is red, and it's going to be red until the very end of the very last line that you re-implement, refactor. It will be green, right? So yes, it's actually an interesting thing with Golden Masters, that they can actually be that very tangible, explicit form of measuring your modernization progress, if we are talking about refactoring certain workflow, for example. Yeah.
It might be worth for our viewers describing exactly what Golden Master is, a Golden Master test is, compared to standard integration or acceptance tests.
We have some blogs written by maybe people on this call, I don't know, but but no, I mean, yeah, absolutely, Abdul, it's a great point. I'd say for me, I mean, the definitions vary to a degree, but it's the idea that usually when you're writing, say, like a unit test or integration test, I mean, obviously if you're using TDD, you're saying what you expect to happen. So like, what's the behavior of the system that I expect? And then you write your test, and then is the code doing as you expect. The main difference for me, and you can have Golden Masters that are unit and integration, but generally they're slightly higher level. But the difference is that you're running the system with various different inputs, and then you're getting various different outputs. And I'm simplifying because it's not always as clear cut as that. Obviously, a lot of the examples in literature online will use simple examples because it's a nice way to get across the point. But then you're basically in some way capturing what the system is doing, and then you're then using that as a baseline, which then means that you can basically then run these tests tomorrow. You could have made some changes and see, well, actually, are the outputs different to the baseline that you've captured today? It does, of course, get more complicated, and there's some different ways you can do it. But that in essence is the way I use it to characterize the behavior of the system, sort of lock in place. Of course, many people will be like, okay, so you're capturing what the system does now. How do you know that what the system does now is what it should be doing? Again, you have to lean somewhat on the domain experts in the area. You'll have to go through the data with them. But to a degree, it might not be feasible to go through all of them, depending on how much data you gather. But you will have to make some assumption and sort of assume, well, this is what it is today. Are we making it worse or better? And there might be some results you look at and you say, actually, these look a bit strange. These right. And you may, in the process of developing them, for sure, maybe you might find some bugs, but to a degree, you have to trust what you capture. Again, depending on the scale of what you're doing.
For me, like if I can add something to what you mentioned, Sam, is if you mentioned like unit tests and integration tests and like proper ones, which are then part of the natural documentation, living documentation, right? So they should be maintainable, readable. There's be like high quality of these tests, actually, not only what they test, but also the way they are written. With Golden Masters, in the end, they are meant to be scrapped once you achieve certain goal of your modernization, right? So usually they are not meant to like last, right? They are just there for very specific things. So you may not find them the most maintainable and most readable types of tests, but they do their specific job very well.
Yeah, exactly. They're meant to be reasonably short-lived, and they're there, as you said, to serve a purpose. The reason you generally use them as well is maybe you can't write the lower down tests as well. You can't write them for whatever reason.
At least at the beginning, right? So
yeah, exactly.
At least at the beginning. So one of the things to watch out for is that the delivery teams won't start using these as their typical in their feedback loops, right? So just something to watch out for, because they're just not there to be maintained and be really readable. So very hard to keep a suite of golden master tests as your main testing suite, right? So just something to keep in mind, because it may feel tempting at some point.
Yeah, I mean, you want to develop your unit integration tests, et cetera, and then you push out the golden master. You get to a point where you have enough where you can actually start writing those tests, changing the code, and start to push them out and get rid of them. And then you're relying on, as you said, the high quality formal documentation tests. That will in general be much faster as well. Will give you faster feedback than, because the tests often are run from so far sort of on the boundary. They're much slower and expensive to run as well. So yeah, favor your more unit and integration tests.
Performance is not the perk of golden masters, definitely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they usually you run them at nightly build or something, and you come in the morning and you see the results. And
yeah, exactly. Feedback's generally a lot slower. That's a good point. One thing I want to talk about, which I think we touched on a little bit, is the domain knowledge, because you're in this sort of, after this, even during discovery, you're going to be relying on those domain experts and whoever has the knowledge to try and explain certain concepts and transfer knowledge to a degree. However, throughout, and particularly during the beginning, you're going to need to lean on those domain experts and find ways of making up for the fact that you're going to lack that domain knowledge, because for sure people are going to have this domain knowledge and you're not, unless you've been in this area for ages. But assuming you're coming to this modernization project fresh, how do you think, guys, how can you try and solve that problem, at least to a degree?
I think there's two sides to this. So first of all, how do you capture the information? I think there's quite a few techniques out there. I think event storming is one. Another one is domain storytelling. They both essentially capture the domain within the context of business capability. So when we talk about domain knowledge, it's important to think about it not in terms of technical behavior, but in terms of what does the business do. So if you think about an application that's taking orders for groceries, right? What's the life cycle? Someone goes onto the website, they purchase something, they call it, a basket or whatever, and then they check out the basket, and all those kind of domain terms. It's where you kind of get domain knowledge. It tells you what it's supposed to do, and the role of a system or a bound context within that. So I think the most important thing is to go through that, focus on it predominantly from the business side to begin with. I think where I find the biggest challenge comes in is the fact that often, not always, but often these systems have been designed and built without great domain knowledge in itself. So you can go to a business user or SME, and they can describe the domain in potentially glowing terms, and then you look at the software and it doesn't reflect that domain very well. So I think there's that kind of, that's one of the bigger challenges I find. I think you can capture that information. I'd recommend just using techniques that are already out there like domain storytelling, but then mapping that back to the software in a kind of feasible way can be very difficult, just because DDD principles haven't been applied when actually developing the software itself. At which point you've got to make some decisions and judgment calls.
You have to be aware that once you start digging in and asking people about that core business knowledge and what things should be doing, like from business perspective, you may find that there's no centralized place, like no one person that knows it all. It's like you have to talk to a lot of people. And actually, once you be talking to them and telling to them like how the conversations went with others, actually they will rediscover the system in some way. They will understand it, right? So there's just a lot of the time they understand it through, I don't know, like the UI, right? Through the screens, not through like the core business workflows, let's say. So that's something from my experience you most likely encounter. And I think in general, if I can generalize a bit our discussion, like whatever we are discussing, so the safety net, the domain stuff, the figuring out of those architectural quality attributes and the metrics, it's like take your time in sprint 0, but then do not fixate on still chiseling them out perfectly before you do anything with the code, basically. So just sprint 0, like consider all of them, but then start doing something and try to reach that MVP. And so think about all those things as well, but do not have that perfect domain view. Don't have that perfect, these are the exact metric that we'll be going for. So do not aim for perfection initially, right? It's all about that iterative process.
I think there's an idea, a twofold idea. One is that you have to have a perfect domain model to begin with. But DDD is iterative, right? So you start off with what you think it is, you implement it, and then you find those gaps and you refine it over time. And that's part of becoming an SME in the space, is you learn about it. But then the other side of that, I think what a lot of people don't think about is that domains evolve, right? Business capabilities evolve, markets change. So even if you can try and pin down what you think is perfection today, which it probably is not perfection today, it will inevitably change. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You just got to kind of put a kind of line in the sand and say, this is good enough, let's implement it. And then as we learn more, we will just evolve the model. If the software is written well, you can do that.
You're going to have to be okay with the fact that there's going to be a few fuzzy things in the beginning, and you move forward with the best information you have, acknowledging that you are going to have to reevaluate, as we spoke about before. You're going to have to rethink a few things as well, because for sure there's going to be things that maybe either the way it was explained by a domain expert or the way that you interpreted it, or there's like an edge case that maybe wasn't explained. You'll then have to really rethink some things, because you'll get some new information and say, actually, this isn't how it works. Or as you said, Abdul, like on paper, this is how it works. In the code, oh no, it doesn't quite well at that. And you'll be like, oh, okay, so we found this situation, and in some cases it might be, oh, did we find a bug? Like, this isn't what it should be doing. What should it be doing? And you see what I mean? So you start having those conversations, but you only get to that point by moving forward, as you said, and accepting the fact that you're going to have to start from an imperfect place, or the best place you can at the time with the information that's available. Alrighty, thank you very much, everyone. I think we'll wrap up there. Any thoughts, reflections on this conversation?
This last point is like key for me in the end, right? So it's like after the discovery, you have the initial set of initiatives, the initial like that was the most critical bits of the workload, most likely. But then you have another set of things to think about, right? So what are the metrics that you're going to use to measure your progress? Like the domain knowledge, right? You need to like really dig in and know like really the domain as well. You need to think about how you're going to create those safety nets, which is through the testing suites, through SDLC automation to get the feedback. And you'll have to do all of those things, but keep in mind, don't try to be pitch perfect with them from the very beginning. Try to start actually in terms of modernization and keep those things in mind and iteratively try to work on them as well. So that's like a key takeaway, I guess, for myself.
I think my biggest summary would be just iterate, focus on iteration, focus on failing and learning at all stages in your project. And perfection's that kind of target you'll never achieve, but it's a worthy target. You just have to iterate across it, and eventually you'll get where you need to. But you have to start with that mentality.
I think for me, sort of along the same lines. It is all one big experiment, and don't kid yourself that it's not. Like you're going to have the discipline of a scientist. You're going to have to look at data, consult data, and be like, "Oh, we're moving in the right direction." So for me, yeah, it's the fact that it's an experiment. Even though you define these phases, and you might have a bias towards action and sort of quote unquote delivery, as you follow on from discovery, you're still going to be discovering, et cetera, et cetera. And it's all it's all going to be a mix to a degree, and you might go through sort of micro cycles within that. But yeah, it's all one big experiment, guys. Remember that. I think next time we're going to have lots of things to dig into. There's lots of things that I wanted to dig into today, which we can get into more in the next one. Of course, for everyone watching and listening, feel free to give us your comments, feedback. feel free to, like, subscribe, all that good stuff, make a meme, whatever you want to do. But yeah, get in touch with any feedback you have, and also any topics you want us to speak about in future episodes as well. But yeah, it's been great, guys. I've loved this yet again, and I look forward to speaking again. So thank you very much.